You know, if you watch the original Star Wars backwards, it's the story of a veteran fighter pilot who's had enough of war and finally manages to find himself a nice piece of retirement property way away from everything where he can live in peace and quiet. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green, and today our topic is the idea of reading Orwell backwards, and that's exactly what I did. I've often maintained and said publicly that 1984 is such a brilliant insight into the mind of the tyrannical collectivist that it's almost an instruction manual on how to pull it off. And having not read it in decades, I decided to read 1984 again, and it was better than I remembered it. And at the end of 1984 on iBooks, you get a chance to see some other things written by Orwell. So I said, Animal Farm. I haven't seen that cartoon or read that book in a long time. So I read Animal Farm, not nearly as sophisticated as 1984, but 1984 was written in 1948. Animal Farm was written in 1943. And when Animal Farm was published, by the way, they almost didn't publish it because it was clearly a criticism of Stalin, and everybody on the left worshipped Stalin in 1943, and all of Britain worshipped the Russians for a long time thereafter. And then something interesting happened. After I got done with Animal Farm, I saw a book by George Orwell called The Road to Wigan Pier. And I thought, why does that sound familiar to me? And I realized it sounds familiar to me because all of my ancestors on my father's side of the family come from Wigan, which is a very small mining and industrial town in Lancashire in the northwest part of Britain. So I bought that book and read it eagerly. Now, I know this is a lot of setup, but hopefully it'll bear its weight. The first part of this book is about the condition of miners in 1937 when he wrote the book in the town of Wigan and surrounding towns like Sheffield and so on. And these are my people. This is where I come from. And I had known that they endured hardships, but I had no idea whatsoever what these people went through. Orwell lived among the miners and told their story. And just to give you some small idea of the kind of thing he's talking about, he didn't know until he got into an actual coal mine that these people would go down in a cage 700, 800, 900 feet, 1,000 feet below the ground. And then in a hallway that was maybe 5 foot tall, hunched over, they would have to walk at least a mile, sometimes as much as 5 miles underground in order to get to the face of the coal that they were actually excavating. These machines were creating so much dust you couldn't see the hand in front of your face. That dust got into your lungs, and that's how you died, black lung disease. He said that the coal miners looked like they had their faces tattooed because the little scratches that the flying coal chips would make would get coal inside the scratch, which would then heal over, and you essentially had a permanent tattoo on your face.
Wow.
They said some of these older men looked like their foreheads looked like it was made out of blue cheese. And just because this needs to be said, he told a story about one miner who was trapped in a collapse. His friends got to him in time, dug him out. He's lying there with his head and shoulders above the ground. They could see that the ceiling was giving way, so the other guys ran away. The ceiling collapsed on him, buried him alive a second time. They were able to get back to him again, uncover his head long enough for him to breathe. They realized the whole thing was coming down, so he was buried alive for a third time, and that was the one that finally killed him. These miners had something called buttons down the back, where the top of all of their vertebrae carried either calluses or scars on them constantly, just scabs on each one of the bumps of their vertebrae because they were running their back against the ceiling as they're trying to walk to and from work. Now, this is the world that George Orwell described in 1937, and I was utterly moved by it, and I was utterly furious at the company that would put people into those kind of conditions.
Yes.
They would rent them a special lamp called a Davy lamp, which was safe for miners, and the company rented it to the miners for whatever it was. And Orwell pointed out that the company is renting them a vital piece of survival equipment that they can't do their jobs without at such a rate that they were basically buying the thing 3 or 4 times a year. They just didn't have the money to sit down and plunk it down. So here's why I'm bringing all of this up. First half of this book is this tremendous illustrative look at the horrible working conditions of miners and the industrial poor in the mid-30s in Britain. And the second half of a book is a trumpeted call for socialism. It's not just a kind of an appeal for socialism. The second half of the book is just page after page after page of justification for socialism, which he had so beautifully destroyed 10 years later in 1984.
Yeah.
So if you read Orwell backwards, it's a story of a man who comes out as the most beautifully written anti-communist statement ever. Watch him going backwards to thinking, well, the problem with socialism is that the pigs always take over. Watching him go backwards is saying it's either fascism or socialism. Socialism is the answer for everything. Our future is collectivist. So, Steve, I wanted to start with you. The reason I found this so interesting is because, as you know, as everybody knows, socialism's getting a new hearing in our society, in our culture. It's once again being touted as the cure for all ills. And the thing that struck me the most about this was that Orwell, when he was promoting socialism, he said there's two things that socialism represents. He said it represents justice and it represents liberty. I don't think it represents either one of those two, but that's what he was fighting for. He was fighting for justice and liberty. He said that's what our motto ought to be. Now, obviously, Orwell got it wrong. But don't you find that modern socialists, the Bernie Sanders socialists and all of the socialists of today, are basing their entire political philosophy on an era in the unfolding of the beginning of the industrial age, where capitalism was in fact a fat guy with a bag of money and represents nothing like what we consider to be capitalism, which is much more reasonably called a free market economy, where anybody can get in and play the game.
Yeah, they're gonna kill the golden goose so that we're forced back into the mines. Maybe that's the point.
Yeah.
I don't know. Actually, maybe I do know. I think it was Churchill who said that a young man who isn't a liberal has no heart, and an old man who isn't conservative has no brain. Well, apparently, I never had a heart, because I was spared the typical junior high school, college fling with leftism or socialism. My dad had me on a reading program. I didn't realize it for years later until I looked back and went, oh, nice move, Dad. But I was spared all that because Dad, when I was 12 over summer vacation, handed me a copy of Brave New World and said, here, read this. And I read it, and it was really good. And I went back and I reread it just a couple of years ago, and the prose is very modern and very light and very fresh, which is strange, talking about this sort of high-tech dystopia, which is, I think, what the modern left thinks they're going to give us now. They have Brave New World is much more their model than 1984.
That's
but
right.
They'll get 1984. The next summer, 13 years old, Dad gives me a copy of 1984 and says, here, why don't you read this over the summer? And I did, and I devoured it. I'm like, wow, that's a great book. The next year, 14, he turned me in a different direction. He gave me a copy of The Fountainhead and said, here, read this. And such a piercing critique of leftist thought in that book. And the next summer, well, Dad died, so I didn't get a copy of Atlas Shrugged from him. So I picked it up on my own and read it that summer. And Ayn Rand was so wrong about people and the way we should treat each other, I came to realize years later. But as a critic of leftist thought, as an exposer of leftist thought, as somebody who could really peer into progressivism, socialism, communism, and expose its essence, she was unparalleled at that. And as somebody who was able to, in an exciting fictional way, describe how bad philosophy leads to bad results, again, I think she probably had no peer in that. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is this. If you're coming up in Britain with its rigid class structure where miners literally could not leave the land, they were tied to it, yeah, I could actually understand becoming a socialist. But this is 21st century America. We shop on the shoulders of giants, to coin a phrase. The evil capitalists built this country, and they've made it something terrific and special. And that possibility was given to us by the founders of this country, who, by and large, were capitalists themselves, whether they practiced law or printed newspapers or had small shops or whatever. And that is our heritage, and the left has got to squash that out because it's what they do, Bill.
Yep. Well, Scott, needless to say, this Road to Wigan in 1937 was written pretty much at the height of the Depression. He could see that fascism was rising, Hitler was rising. He had pretty much written off capitalism as a dying philosophy. He really just said, and this is one of the many fallacies in his argument for socialism. He said there are going to be so many more inventions when we get socialism, because right now you only invent things for which there's an economic market. But when we have socialism, we'll be inventing all of these wonderful things just because of the public good. He missed that one by quite a long distance. But given what he saw in the mines in Wigan, and given the misery and the just the privation, the degradation, the filth, the utter filth, and the heartlessness of the companies that used people just as so many, pieces of iron that had to be born to get this stuff out of the earth. I think you can forgive him for this. I guess what I'm struggling is, Scott, is this. It was weird reading him backwards. My opinion of him went down.
Yeah.
When in point of fact, his actual life is how it should be read, where his opinion should rise. And reading him backwards was interesting to see how many of the misconceptions that he had at the end of the reading were eliminated by what he wrote at the beginning of the readings. And I guess what I'm asking you, Scott, is this. In the middle of all of these discussions and all of these books, there was never, ever a sense of America or conservatism as we understand it. In other words, it was going to be either the fascists or the communists. That was the future. You had to pick one.
Yeah.
And he said anybody with a heart would pick socialism. And I think probably if those are your only two choices, that's probably what you would pick. But here's a guy who went on to write what socialism could do. What do you think about the fact that he missed the whole thing that was going on across the Atlantic, which was we can't put a wall around the pigs on Animal Farm. We cannot stop human beings from desiring power and getting it under any means necessary. So we're going to protect the individual by building a wall around the individual. The whole American experiment never even seemed to have occurred to him.
Well, yeah, and certainly all artists create within the context of their own culture. And, he only knows what he knows. He only sees what he sees. And, as you describe this, it made me think, what if I went back in time and I got to meet a young George Orwell, maybe in 35, 36, 37, around that time. I think what I would, knowing what I know now, I think what I would have said to him is, keep the passion alive, keep watching, keep describing, but hold off on prescribing. Just keep paying attention, keep documenting, but wait until you've been able to gather enough life experience and information to fully understand the scope of the challenge here before you leap to the conclusion that because I have branded this kind of activity as capitalist, and the only distinct alternative to that is socialist, then therefore I don't like the first, I'll take the second. And I think that's what happens with age. I mean, the track that you charted of his growth from 37 through 48 is kind of the track that I went on. I didn't have the same pattern that Steve had, were introduced early. I was trying to think, what's the early book? The only early book I can remember reading is one I found in my grandfather's attic, which I think belonged to my mom, which was Gone with the Wind, and I read that twice. But I just think what it says to me is this. Okay, since I don't have a time machine and I can't go back and talk to a young George Orwell and tell him to observe and describe, but hold off on prescribing, how now shall I treat the people who are mired in this kind of passion for injustice as they see it? And I think it brings to mind grace and compassion and a sense of obligation of mentorship, rather than crushing their spirit, rather than insulting them that they're wrong, rather than trying to bypass all the life experience that it takes to fully understand the nature of a problem and the contours of a solution, but rather to sit back and go, okay, my friend, my son, keep watching, keep describing, keep that passion for justice and liberty, but hold off on prescribing the solution. Learn, grow, and there'll come a point in your life where you'll realize that the time-worn and tired solutions like socialism have failed over and over again, not only failed spectacularly, but resulted in greater misery. But that free markets, within the context of a broken humanity, is about as good as we can hope for. Hang on, stay with us, don't get discouraged.
And that is precisely what he did. Orwell uses terms like the bourgeoisie and the proletariat back and forth, and these were the terms he used to describe a very highly stratified society, and this was the language that he used, and the more of it I read, the more outdated he seemed. But this is an important point to bear. Orwell is excruciatingly honest, and that in itself is an admirable quality for anybody, or any writer, anybody, excruciatingly honest. And when he begins his campaign for socialism, he does so and describes why. And the reason that he became so passionate about injustice was that he was for 5 years a member of the British police force in Burma, inflicting the British rule upon the Burmese people. And he grew to hate himself. And he knew many other people in the bureaucracy of the British Empire who grew to hate what they were doing, knew what they were doing was wrong and evil, executing people from other countries, this foreign power just basically invading. So he plainly admits that he became a socialist out of a sense of guilt, and he said that in order to feel clean, he had to get dirty. There's a tremendous intellectual honesty in this. And the fact that he thought that socialism represented liberty and justice means he was looking for the right things. In 1984, he could have called that repressive social system Ingfas, for English fascism, but he didn't. He called it Ingsoc, English socialism. He understood that the dreams he'd had 10 years earlier led to the worst possible form of government, and described a tyranny in 1984 of a collectivist future where tyranny will last forever using the tools of science. I admire him very much, and for people who would say you shouldn't admire him, he was a socialist, if you read his life backwards, as I just did, you'll be very disappointed. If you read it in the order in which it happened, you'll realize as a man who seemed to be looking for justice and liberty, finding out that the things he thought would provide them wouldn't. And I feel like if he was alive today, he'd be a rock-ribbed conservative. Anyway, that'll do it for this Right Angle, brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com, to whom we're eternally grateful. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next week.